Hello and welcome to Talent Week hosted by Qualtrics. This session is titled Give a Damn, Get Stuff Done and Other Essentials of Being a Great Boss, and it will be presented by Kim Scott, CEO Coach. We're grateful to have all of you here with us at the largest online human capital event. Before we jump in, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. First, the recording and slides for today's presentation will be made available on talentweek.com along with other content and webinars from throughout the week. Make sure to join the conversation online using the hashtags and Twitter handles on the screen. And lastly, it's not too late to register. Obviously, you're here with us, but make sure to include your networks in the conversation and register your teams, colleagues, and connections so they also can participate in this exciting event. With that, let me introduce our speaker. Kim Scott is the CEO and founder of Radical Candor Incorporated, which builds software tools for managers. Her book, Radical Candor, How to Be a Kickass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity, will be published next spring. Kim is an advisor at Dropbox, Kerbo, Qualtrics, Real Good App, Rolltape, Chip, Twitter, and several Silicon Valley startups. Earlier this year, she joined our very own Qualtrics as a member of its board of directors. She was a member of the faculty at Apple University, and before that led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick online sales and operations at Google. Known for her ability to generate billions of dollars in revenue from millions of small customers while keeping her team happy and margins high, her unofficial title was High Priestess of the Long Tail. Previously, Kim was co-founder and CEO of Juice Software, a collaboration startup, and led business development at two other startups, Delta 3 and Capital Thinking. Earlier in her career, Kim worked as a senior policy advisor at the FCC, managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo, started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow, and was an analyst on the Soviet Companies Fund. She is the author of 3 novels, Virtual Love, The House Husband, and The Measurement Problem. She and her husband, Andy Scott, are parents of twins. Kim Scott is one heck of a person, and we are so glad to have her here with us today. And with that, Kim, I'd like to turn the time over to you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction, and I am thrilled to be here today. What I'm going to talk about today is one of the 4th most important things that great bosses do, guidance. At a lot of companies, this might be called feedback, but feedback is screechy and makes most people want to cover their ears, and guidance is something we all want. Now, if I had been paying attention in college when I read John Stuart Mill, I could have saved myself one of the worst moments of my career. So John Stuart Mill says the whole truth and value of human judgment depends on the one property that it can be set right when it is wrong. However, when I was the CEO at a software startup called Juice, there was a guy who was working for me who I really liked a lot. His name was Bob, and Bob was funny. He was charming. He was one of my favorite people. He used to in staff meetings, instead of playing the usual stupid get-to-know-you questions, make us all take a look at and confess to each other what candy our parents had used to toilet train us. Oddly enough, we all remembered it. So he was fun. He was fun to work with, and he was a good guy. Unfortunately, there was a big problem. He was doing terrible work. And I did not tell him nearly soon enough. And perhaps the worst moment of my career came when I had to fire Bob. And he looked at me and he said, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me?" And I realized in that moment that I had totally failed Bob. And I had failed him in several really important ways. I had failed to criticize him. I had also failed to praise him. I had also failed to ask him for his praise or criticism of what I was doing. And perhaps worst of all, I had failed to encourage praise or criticism between Bob and the other people who worked at the company. So I had failed in at least 6 different ways, and now I was having to fire Bob because of it. And unfortunately, it was just too late. Once I explained the situation to Bob, even he agreed that he should go. So he was now suffering for a mistake that I made. And the only thing I could do at that point was really make a sincere promise to myself that I would never make the same mistake again. And so what I did was sort of a failed report card was not really going to help me in the heat of the moment of these hard sort of management moments. So what I did was I came up with a very simple framework that would help me always remember to give people really good guidance, to get guidance from them, and to encourage them to give guidance to each other. So what I'm going to do is walk you through it, explain it, and hopefully you can use it as well. So on the vertical axis is what I call the sort of give a damn axis. It looks something like this, not surprisingly. You've got to care personally about people. One of the things that I learned in my career is that when you're a boss, you really do have a deep personal relationship with the people who work for you. It's not a friendship. It's a different kind of relationship than you've ever had in any other part of your life. But the best bosses I know genuinely care personally about each of their direct reports. Now, that wasn't really where I made my mistake. What tripped me up was the horizontal axis, what Colin Powell would call the willing to piss people off axis. Colin Powell said that great leaders must be willing to piss people off. So on the horizontal axis is what I call challenge directly. This sort of goes back to that quote that I read at the beginning from John Stuart Mill. It's a boss's job to show that not only that they care about people, but also to tell them when their work isn't nearly good enough. And that's a really, really hard thing for most of us to do. What I'm going to do is now explain how this works with a very simple case study. Somebody walks out of the restroom with their fly down, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to tell them if their fly is down. So in the upper right-hand quadrant, the quadrant that I'll later call sort of a radical candor, you whisper, Red, your fly is down. You just tell the person. In this case, the person's name is Red. And that's obviously the right thing to do, but also in a lot of cases it doesn't happen. If you happen to be in the bottom right-hand quadrant, affectionately known as the asshole quadrant, you might shout, look everybody, Red's fly is down. So you actually, you challenge Red directly, but you sort of don't care about him. In fact, you try to humiliate him. If you're in the lower left quadrant, which is really the worst of all quadrants, you're either silent because you don't want to embarrass yourself. You're worried about your own feelings, not Red's. Or maybe you're silent in front of Red, but then you whisper to somebody else, sort of trying to make yourself look smart, but never challenging Red directly and not caring about Red. And then the upper left quadrant is where, in my experience, the bulk of management mistakes happen. You're silent, you don't say anything to Red because you care about Red and you really genuinely don't want to embarrass Red. You're not worried about yourself, you're worried about Red. So let's take a look at what this looks like in more complicated management situations. Let's first take a look at how the framework plays out when the stakes are higher and you're giving criticism to people about either the content of their work or just their work style. One of my favorite examples of what I call radical candor in giving criticism happened to me when I worked at Google. Shortly after I joined there, my boss, who was at the time Sheryl Sandberg, told me that after a presentation that I had given to Google's founders, explaining just how great Google's business was, well, the AdSense business in particular, was doing, Sheryl told me in a situation which will become embarrassing for reasons that will become clear to you momentarily. She said, you know, you did a great job, Kim. She walked out of the meeting with me. She said, you did a great job, Kim. I'm really excited to see how well the business is doing, but you said a lot, and it made you sound kind of stupid. Now, a lot of people would say that Cheryl was being harsh when she said that to me, but the truth was, if she hadn't said it to me just that clearly, and she knew me well enough to know this, I wouldn't have listened to her, because who cared if I said And in fact, I still do say but what she said next actually helped. I would be saying approximately 50 times more in this presentation if I hadn't bumped into Cheryl in my career than if I had. Because what she said next was, if you just go see a speech coach, you can actually help yourself solve this problem. And if it's a problem that's that easy to fix, it's not really that big of a problem, is it? So what did Cheryl do in that moment? She was sort of humble about it. She walked out right away with me. She made sure to tell me what I did well, to show she had showed me in 1,000 other ways that she cared personally about me. But she told me immediately. She didn't wait for a one-on-one. She certainly didn't wait for a performance review. She told me right away. She told me offering help, and she told me in private, right? So that is the right way to offer feedback. Although it was hard to hear in the moment, one of the things that has made it easier for me when I have to tell somebody else that their work isn't good enough or they screwed up on a presentation is to remember that story and remember that even though it was hard for me to hear in the moment that I had sounded stupid in this presentation, which was the last thing in the world. Being stupid at Google is kind of a cardinal sin. It was the last thing I wanted to do. It really helped me find the energy to go see the speech coach. The speech coach helped me, and I'm still grateful to Cheryl to this day. So that is a story that sort of a go-to story for myself that I remember. I want to be like Cheryl when I'm trying to criticize somebody in the right way, in a way that is both humble, helpful, instant, private, without personalizing. And I recommend that you think of a time when somebody criticized you and it was very helpful. It'll make it easier for you to criticize others. Let's look at a few case studies where criticism didn't go so well, though. Let's take a look at obnoxious aggression. Now, I would say if you can't offer radical candor, and this is a controversial statement, but if you can't offer radical candor, the second best thing you can do is actually be a jerk. The other two quadrants are much worse for the people that who work for you. But let me also make it clear that I'm second to none in my dislike of assholes, which is why it is so painful for me to admit that more than one time, often I myself have been a complete and total jerk. I'll tell you one story. Shortly after I had joined Google, I disagreed with a policy decision that Larry Page, one of the founders, had made. And I sent an email around to a bunch of people saying, Larry says he wants to organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, but I think this policy shows he just wants to make a buck and he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information. Now, as it turned out, my accusation was completely wrong and unfair, but it was also obnoxious. It was annoying. Now, why did I do that? As I think about, if Larry, instead of being one of the sort of business geniuses of our time, were one of my employees, I never would have sent around such a obnoxious, aggressive, sort of arrogant email. And I also certainly I would have addressed it directly with him. I wouldn't have behaved that way. So why did I do it with Larry? I didn't really feel the need to care personally about him because I viewed him almost as a sort of demigod that I could throw stones at with impunity. And I have found in my advisory work that this happens pretty often. People often will protect their teams, but they'll be kind of obnoxious to the people who are more senior to them because they don't feel the need to care personally about them. So that was one of my moments of being a jerk. But it wasn't actually that moment that really got me into trouble at Google. What got me into a lot more trouble than the obnoxious email I sent around was the insincere apology that I gave Larry when I realized I had probably stepped over a line. I bumped into him in the hallway after he had mentioned to my boss that I had been kind of obnoxious. And I hadn't really taken the time to understand the details of the issue enough to know that I was wrong. I simply apologized and said I was wrong without meaning to. And I'm not a really very good liar, and Larry has a good bullshit meter, and he sort of looked at me like, ugh. It was so pronounced that this friend of mine who I worked with sort of patted me on the shoulder later and said he likes it better actually when you disagree with him. So whatever you do, don't be manipulatively insincere. And again, ruinous empathy. This is what I did to Bob, and this is the most common mistake when giving criticism. You do care personally about somebody, and you let your empathy for that person prevent you from actually doing the right thing, which is to tell them when they're screwing up. So that's criticism. Let's spend a couple of minutes on praise as well. I'll probably spend a little less time on praise, not because it is not just as important as criticism. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that in order to preserve your relationships, you should give 7 times as much praise or 5 times as much praise as you do criticism. But the reason why I focus so much on giving criticism is that it's the single thing that many bosses, managers are most reluctant to do. So let's take a look at how the sort of simple 2x2 framework plays out when it comes time for a boss to give praise. So radical candor. Another painful moment from my career at Google came when I was giving another presentation to the founders about how great the AdSense business was doing. And I sort of expected, it's a little shameful to say what I expected, but I expected Sergey Brin to look at me and say, this business is on fire and I'm so happy that we have a genius like you, Kim, to run it. Instead, what he said was, that's pretty good, but have you thought of this? I'd love to help you with this idea. So he was willing to challenge directly, not just let me rest on my laurels, and he also was willing to offer some help to show that he cared personally. And he was very specific. I'm not going to share the idea with you because it was confidential, but he was pretty specific about his idea, what he thought was going well, and also obviously sincere that he liked what was happening. So basically, the idea of radical candor is that don't hand out compliments like they're candy. For the very same reason that if you were criticizing somebody, you wouldn't say, "Hey, you're a moron." If you're praising somebody, don't say, "Hey, you're a genius." Let me tell you some stories about praise gone wrong. What would somebody who is a jerk do when it comes time to praise people? I'm going to read you an email from an executive who will go unnamed at a company who will go unnamed, that will go unnamed. This executive, we'll call him John Doe, sent out an email to a team of thousands of people trying to praise people for getting spot bonuses. But he obviously didn't really care personally about the people that he was praising. And in fact, it was pretty clear that he thought it was stupid to have to do this at all, given how sloppy he was. I'll just read you a couple of the blurbs he sent out about these people. So name number 33. This guy is a level 5 seller. He drove the highest quarter-to-date revenue of any display seller, $7.5 million in quarter 3. His comp is at $70,000 base and an OTE of $116,000. That's 50% below market. He's a retention risk. So imagine how person number 33 felt when he saw his salary had been sent out to thousands of people, along with the fact that he was being paid half of what he should have been and was probably looking for other jobs. Not exactly a good way to praise somebody. And just obvious that that John Doe did not care. It was sort of insincere at the least. What would ruinous praise that is sort of ruinously empathetic look like? The most famous case took place during Hurricane Katrina, when George Bush, just trying to be a nice guy, trying to be supportive of his people, said, "Heck of a job, Brownie." The problem was that Brown was not doing a good job. Brown was the head of FEMA, who had been doing an utterly disastrous job. And Brown wrote later that one of the worst things that ever happened to him in his career was not his mishandling of the hurricane and the flooding that resulted, but rather Bush's praise of him. So praise gone wrong. If somebody, make sure you take the time to know whether or not somebody is in fact doing a good job before you praise them. Don't hand it out like candy. Finally, manipulative insincerity. What would that look like when it comes to praise? It's basically just flattery. There was a friend of mine who bumped into a Silicon Valley sort of celebrity who wanted something from him and praised him. And my friend came back sort of full of disgust, and he said to me, "Does he think just because he's so famous that it means I'm so stupid I can't see? He doesn't mean a word he says." Just because you're the boss doesn't mean people don't see through you. So if you're not sincere, don't say it. And if you don't know the details, don't praise people. Be specific and sincere. Let's take a look at how the framework works when it comes to getting guidance from people, right? So getting praise and criticism from the people who work for you. In this section, getting guidance, I'm mostly going to talk about getting criticism. As a boss, you're going to have so many people who are trying to flatter you that you really don't need to go fishing for compliments. Instead, you really just need a good BS meter. So let's take a look at radical candor. How would somebody who's being radically candid get criticism from people? The thing here to remember is that when you're the boss and you ask somebody to give you criticism, you're sort of putting them in an uncomfortable situation. And in order to get radical candor from people, you need to embrace the discomfort and then reward the truth. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. One of my favorite examples of embracing the discomfort was something that Toyota did. When new people joined Toyota and were on the assembly line, at the end of the first week, Toyota would draw a red box on the assembly line, put people in the red box, and tell them they couldn't leave the red box until they had criticized at least one thing that they saw. So sometimes you need to go to extreme lengths to make people to show people that you really want to hear their criticism and to get people through the discomfort of giving you criticism. What does rewarding the truth look like? And what does it look like what if you know you can't quite fix the problem right away? So one time I had an employee who told me that I interrupted him often in meetings, and it really bothered him. Now, I knew this was true. I'm an inveterate interrupter, and I knew I couldn't fix it immediately. This was a sort of a personality flaw that had bedeviled me for years. So what I decided to do was to show him that I heard him, to show him that I cared, by putting a rubber band around my wrist, sitting next to him in the next meeting and saying, look, Russ, I know that I do interrupt you. I'll admit it. And I'm really sorry about it. And I want you to help me fix it. Every time I interrupt you in this meeting or any other, I want you to snap the rubber band. So that was a way of rewarding the truth. And Russ and I had the kind of relationship in which he was more than happy to snap the rubber band. And it did a lot of good things. It showed Russ that I heard him. It showed Russ I cared. It showed Russ that I was trying to get better. It also showed the rest of the team that I was open to criticism and that I wanted it, that they could offer it sort of almost in a spirit of fun. So that was, I found, helpful. But let's take a look at the next quadrant. What does obnoxious aggression look like when you're trying to solicit criticism from people? One of my favorite stories comes from Apple. There was a team of people who disagreed vehemently with something that Steve Jobs was trying to do. And to his credit, he allowed them to challenge him directly. He was open to the criticism, but he didn't really do a good job of showing that he cared personally. In fact, rather than being gracious and saying, you all are right, I was wrong, thank you, the way that he in the end accepted the criticism was to stand up, say, you assholes can do whatever you want, and storm out of the room and slam the door. So not exactly showing that he cared personally about the people who dared to challenge him. What does ruinous empathy look like when a boss is trying to get criticism from the people who work for him or her? The most common situation that I have seen is a boss says, hey, how's it going? How am I doing? Is there anything I could be doing better? And the employee is really uncomfortable. The employee is put in a very uncomfortable situation. And the employee says what we all say in that situation, which is, everything's fine, great. And the boss, feeling bad for having put the employee in an uncomfortable situation, instead of embracing the discomfort, just lets the employee off the hook and says, oh, thank you very much. And that's the end of the conversation. And nothing real gets said in that moment, unfortunately. So finally, manipulative insincerity. What does it look like when a boss is supposedly trying to get criticism from people but is really being manipulatively insincere? One of the worst examples of this I've ever seen in my career is a leader he was one of the top 10 people at one of the top 10 tech companies in the world. There's some poetic justice in the world because he's no longer there. But anyway, he was then, and he walked into the office of a friend of mine and put his finger on the speakerphone and said, call so-and-so and ask him what he thinks of me, but don't tell him I'm standing here. So what did that do? It basically told everybody that they would be punished for criticizing him and that they might even be overheard and punished. Kind of created a Stalinist-style environment. Not really what you're shooting for, I hope. So let's take a look now at how you can use the simple framework to encourage guidance between the people on your team. And I want to take a minute to explain why encouraging guidance between people is so extremely important. Let's imagine that to be a good boss, you need to make sure that everybody on your team gets, say, 5 pieces of praise and 1 or 2 pieces of criticism, on a daily basis. There's no way you yourself can do it. But if you have 5 people on your team, all of a sudden making sure that people get good guidance in a timely way is much easier. Because if you have 5 people and it's all up to you giving, then then you're looking at doing nothing but giving guidance all day, every day. And you all have a lot of other things to do in addition to this, which are also important. So let's take a look at how you can use the framework to encourage guidance on your team. So what does radical candor look like when encouraging guidance? One of the best examples of this I saw at a startup where I spent some time early in my career. There was a CTO named Dan Woods, and at the beginning of every staff meeting, he would bring out a big stuffed whale named Duke and a big stuffed monkey named Whoops. And he would ask people to give each other praise. Like if you saw somebody do something remarkable over the course of the last week, nominate that person for Duke. And then he would ask people to nominate themselves, not other people, for Whoops the monkey. So if you totally screwed something up this week, nominate yourself for Whoops. And that way you get instant, I promise, Dan said he would promise you instant forgiveness for whatever you screwed up. And the other benefit was that everybody else would learn from your mistake. This was a really simple technique that I used at both my startup Juice and later at Google, and it really helped create a spirit of giving each other praise and open criticism on the team. Another really important thing that you can do, and I'm going to talk more about this later because I think it's one of the most important things that a good boss can do. But another really important thing that you can do when trying to encourage people to give each other criticism is to require joint escalation, or in more simple terms, don't allow people to talk badly about each other behind each other's back, especially not to you when you're the boss. So we'll talk more about the rules of requiring joint escalation later. And one of the best ways I've ever seen of encouraging employees to praise each other, because often people are more reluctant than you would think to praise each other, was a peer bonus system that Google set up. It allowed anybody in the company to give anybody else $100. You just have to fill out a form, explain what they did great. It would send them an email and add to their paycheck $100. This really was extremely popular because it was very bottom. There were some checks and balances to make sure that people didn't give too much. It also would send an email to the person offering the peer bonus, the boss, and also to that person's boss. So there were a few little checks and balances which were obviously necessary, but it wasn't enormously expensive as it might have first seemed, and it was extremely popular and quite effective at encouraging people to praise each other. And it showed Google was putting its money where its mouth was. In terms of saying, but it's important. It's important to take the time to do this for each other. So what does it look like when bosses get it wrong, get encouraging praise and criticism wrong? One of the worst stories I ever heard was a company that had a policy called radical honesty, which sounds good. But when you think about the word honesty, it implies that the person being quote unquote honest knows what the truth is. So it already violates one of the cardinal rules about criticism, which is that it should be humble, right? So in this culture of radical honesty, the CEO of the company decided it was a good idea to tape meetings. And there was one meeting where the criticism became so harsh that one employee burst into tears, like real sobbing. And the tape of that meeting was sent out to the whole company. Now, that certainly is a way to show how to challenge each other directly, but it It's the opposite of caring personally. It was sort of a cruel thing to do, in my opinion, anyway. What does obnoxious aggression look like in terms of encouraging, or in this case, discouraging praise between people? Often you'll hear leaders say, for those of you who need your egos babied, or they'll set up systems that are obviously sort of just babying people's egos. And that tends to actually have a dampening effect on praise rather than encouraging it. Another terrible way to encourage praise and criticism between people is ruinous, what I would term ruinous empathy. What does this look like? Generally, it looks like silence. It sounds like silence. But sometimes trainings unintentionally have this impact. They get people so worried about criticizing in just the right way that they just don't criticize. And that's no good. Another common way that bosses screw up encouraging praise between people is to have kind of a every kid gets a trophy approach, which there's been a ton written about why that doesn't work. I think it's obvious and probably doesn't need belaboring. Finally, manipulative insincerity. How does manipulative insincerity screw up encouraging praise and criticism between people? I'll tell you a story about when I screwed it up. When I was at a particular company, and there were two people in particular on my team who really didn't get along. We'll call them Joe and Todd. So every time I had a one-on-one with Joe, he would tell me all the things Todd was doing wrong. Every time I had a one-on-one with Todd, he would tell me all the things Joe was doing wrong. Just wanting everybody to get along, I tried to sort of a little shuttle diplomacy. I'd go to Joe and say, couldn't you do this? And then they both began to hate each other and to assume correctly that every time I was talking to one of them, I was talking about the other behind his back. And it actually created way more politics and animosity than just requiring them to try to work it out between each other directly. And if they had a problem, they should have just come to me directly. Back to that point I made earlier about requiring joint escalation. I failed to do that because I was being manipulatively insincere. I just wanted everybody to get along and wasn't willing to really force people to address the core of the issue directly. With praise, just a culture of insincere flattery is not actually going to help people get praise right. So those are some ideas about how you can use that simple framework to make sure you're doing a good job in sort of giving praise and criticism to people, soliciting praise and criticism from people, and encouraging praise and criticism between people. But what I want to do now is review sort of 4 specific things that you can do to make sure that you are creating a good culture of guidance on your team. So the first thing is, I've mentioned it a couple of times, as you can tell, I'm passionate on this topic, requiring joint escalation. Another important thing you can do is deliver formal performance reviews well. I'm assuming when I talk about that you've already been giving impromptu guidance all along and encouraging it and getting it. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Third thing you can do is to conduct what I call manager feedback sessions. That sort of make it easier for, if you're a manager of managers, for the people underneath the people who work for you to speak truth to power. And for last but not least, stay centered yourself. So let's focus on requiring joint escalation. Totally simple. But if somebody comes to you complaining about somebody else, ask that person if he or she tried to work it out with the other person. And if the answer is no, send them off to go do that, to go work it out directly. but reassure both of them that if they can't work it out, they can come to you, and you will help them find a good solution. And you need to be genuinely helpful. Don't punish people if they can't work it out, but try to be as fair and fast as possible. I heard a story about one relatively well-known CEO who was well known for punishing the people. If two people came to him, he would be sure to try to come up with a solution that neither one of them liked. And the result there was that people didn't try to work out their differences directly. They didn't try to criticize each other directly. And there wasn't a good culture of guidance at that person's company. So now let's focus for a second on delivering formal performance reviews. Almost nobody likes doing this, but there are a few things you can do that will make it go much more smoothly and maybe even make this part of your job you actually enjoy. First of all, make performance reviews two-way. Ask your employee to give you a review. Make sure that before you deliver a formal performance review, you ask your employees to tell you how they think you're doing. And take it to heart. Take it seriously. Take what they say seriously. I've gotten some of the most valuable feedback of my career from the people who worked for me. Secondly, take some time to write down a formal performance review. You don't have to spend hours and hours doing it, but at least jot down bullet notes. And make sure when you're writing it down, you're not just looking back, you're not just diagnosing the problem, you're also looking forward. You're coming up with a plan to help the person improve. And adjust. Think about if you're going to give the person who you're reviewing what you wrote, think carefully about when you give them what you wrote. Some people will react much better if you give it to them before the conversation. Other people, you'll never have the conversation if you give it to them beforehand. Some people really would rather have it after. And some people you can sort of give it to them sort of as you're talking. So make a conscious decision. There's no one right answer here. Make sure you know your people well enough to understand what will work best for them. Next, give some thought to when you schedule the review. Make sure you schedule at least 50 minutes in person. Really make sure you don't give this conversation short shrift. Don't schedule, by the way, all of these in one day. They're exhausting. So schedule, at most one or two a day in the course of a week. And also schedule some later check-ins to assess how the person's doing on the plan that you came up with. And hopefully that the person agreed to or changed or altered in some way. And finally, often the formal performance reviews have an implication for a rating and for a person's compensation. Make sure you separate out that from the conversation, or else you'll never actually have a real conversation. So give them the rating and compensation news later. At least that's what I always found to be most effective. So third specific thing you can do, this is relevant to you only if you manage managers, if you are a boss of bosses. But if the people who work for you have people who work for them, make sure you're hearing from the people who work for the people who work for you. And do this in not an informal way, but in a kind of formal, ritualized way. I call it a manager feedback session. Some people call it a skip-level meeting, but that sounds kind of hierarchical to me. Anyway, explain that you're going to do this to everyone. Explain it to the people who work for you, and explain the process to the people who work for them. You want to make sure that the meeting is not for attribution. In other words, what people say is going to be told to the manager, but not who said it. And you're going to take notes during the meeting. You're going to project the notes, and you're going to share the notes with everybody in the meeting so that if there is a misunderstanding, it can get fixed right away. You also want to explain you're going to share the notes with the manager right at the end of the meeting. That'll keep people focused on the meeting during the meeting, focused on the conversation. And you also want to explain, obviously, that the reason why you're doing this is not to go on some kind of witch hunt, but to help the person get better. Criticism is a gift, right? So you want to help people. You want to help encourage. You're encouraging people to criticize their boss in a way that helps their boss get better. To speak truth to power, if you will. You want to make sure that you prioritize the issues that you. Not that you prioritize the issues, actually, but that you get the team of people that you're speaking with to prioritize the issues. The reason is that no manager, no matter how good they are, they can't fix everything. So if the person can only do one or two things, you want to make sure they do the one or two most important things. An obvious point, but sometimes these meetings can become great sessions, and focusing on prioritization can help prevent that from happening. Next, as I mentioned before, you want to send the notes out to the manager at the very end of the meeting. So you don't want to have to give yourself the task of editing them later or whatever. You want people to know what's being said and written is what's going to be shared. And finally, you want to require the managers who get the notes to make changes based on the notes and to communicate those changes with their team. If nothing comes of these manager feedback sessions, people will get cynical really fast. Finally, stay centered. You can't possibly give a damn about others if you don't give a damn about yourself. And being a boss is exhausting, and really is going to require you to be at your very best. So make sure you take the time to take good care of yourself. Thank you very much. Those are my key points on being a great boss and being responsible.
Thanks so much, Kim, for those incredible insights and for sharing your expertise with us. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. Make sure to check out the rest of today's content, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send us a tweet using @Qualtrics with the hashtag TalentWeek, or email us at events@qualtrics.com.